There was a moment in history when the ocean stopped being a limit and became a pathway. Before that moment, submarines were powerful but restricted. They could dive, they could disappear, but only for a while, because eventually they had to come back up for air, for power, for survival. And in a war where being seen could mean being destroyed, that limitation changed everything. Now imagine a submarine that never had a surface, a vessel that could remain underwater for weeks, months, crossing entire oceans without ever being detected, a submarine that turned the deep ocean into its permanent domain. That moment didn't just change naval warfare, it changed the balance of power. This is the story of the first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus. At the beginning of the Cold War, the world was already shifting. The United States and Soviet Union were locked in a competition that extended across every domain: land, air, sea, and eventually space. But beneath the surface of the oceans, something equally critical was taking shape. Submarines had proven their value in previous wars. They could disrupt supply lines, conduct surveillance, strike without warning. But they had one fundamental weakness: endurance. Traditional submarines relied on diesel engines. They could operate underwater using batteries, but only for limited periods. Sooner or later, they had to surface or snorkel to recharge. And when they did, they became vulnerable. Radar could detect them, aircraft could find them, and once located, they could be destroyed. For the United States, this was a problem, because as the Cold War intensified, the role of submarines was expanding. They weren't just tactical tools anymore. They were becoming strategic assets, platforms that could carry weapons, gather intelligence, and operate in areas where other forces could not reach. But to fulfill that role, they needed to stay hidden, not for hours, not for days, but for as long as necessary. The challenge was clear. How do you build a submarine that doesn't depend on the surface? How do you remove the one limitation that defines its vulnerability? The answer wasn't incremental. It wasn't an upgrade. It was a transformation. Nuclear power. Instead of relying on fuel that required oxygen, a nuclear reactor could generate energy continuously. No need to surface. No need to recharge. Unlimited endurance. Limited only by food and crew capacity. It was a radical idea. Complex. Risky. And unlike anything that had been attempted before. Because placing a nuclear reactor inside a submarine wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a question of control, of safety, of whether such a system could operate reliably in one of the most demanding environments on Earth, inside the United States. The effort to make this possible brought together some of the most advanced engineering minds of time: designers, physicists, naval officers, all working toward a single objective: to create a submarine that could remain underwater indefinitely. The vessel that emerged from that effort was unlike anything before it. Longer, stronger, built around a reactor that would redefine what submarines could do. And when it was ready, it carried a message that would echo far beyond the ocean. Because for the first time in history, a submarine would no longer be limited by the surface. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where technology redefined entire domains of warfare, consider subscribing, because what the USS Nautilus would go on to demonstrate wasn't just innovation. It was a complete shift in what was possible. Because once it entered the water, the ocean was no longer a barrier. It was an advantage. And the world was about to realize just how powerful that change would be. When the USS Nautilus finally entered the water, it didn't just begin a mission. It began a new era. From the outside, it looked like a submarine. Streamlined, metal hull cutting through the surface, crew moving with precision. But beneath that familiar appearance, everything had changed. Because at its core was something no submarine had ever carried before: a nuclear reactor, silent, powerful, and capable of producing energy without limits. For the crew inside, the difference was immediate. There was no countdown to battery depletion, no need to plan for surfacing, no constant concern about air intake or fuel reserves. Instead, the Nautilus could remain submerged indefinitely. Weeks turned into months. Distances that once required multiple stops could now be completed in a single continuous movement. The ocean was no longer a constraint. It was a space of freedom, and that freedom translated directly into capability. The submarine could move unpredictably, change course without concern, operate in areas that would have been too risky before. Because now, remaining hidden wasn't temporary. It was sustained. Speed also changed. Traditional submarines were fastest on the surface. Underwater, they were slower, conserving battery power. But the Nautilus reversed that logic. It was faster beneath the surface than above it, able to maintain high speeds for extended periods without sacrificing endurance. That combination, speed and stealth, created something entirely new, a platform that could reposition rapidly without being seen. Inside Naval Command, this shift was immediately understood because it meant that submarines were no longer just reactive tools. They could now be proactive, deployed far from home, operating independently, gathering intelligence, positioning themselves in ways that would have been impossible before, and all of it without revealing their presence. But perhaps the most important change wasn't physical. It was strategic, because once a submarine could remain underwater indefinitely, it became unpredictable. An adversary could no longer assume where it was, or when it would surface, or how long it could remain in a specific area. That uncertainty created pressure, because in the Cold War, unpredictability was power. The Nautilus began to demonstrate these capabilities in real operations, extended patrols, long-distance missions, movements that showed clearly that the limitations of the past no longer applied, and each mission reinforced the same idea. This wasn't an experiment. It was a transformation. At the same time, the technology inside the Nautilus had to prove itself, because a nuclear reactor in a submarine wasn't just about performance. It was about reliability. Safety systems were tested continuously. Engineers monitored every aspect of operation: temperatures, pressures, reactor behavior under different conditions, because failure wasn't an option, not in that environment, not with that level of power. And yet, as the Nautilus continued its missions, the system held, stable, controlled, reliable, and with every successful operation, confidence grew, not just in the submarine, but in the concept, because what had once been considered risky was now becoming essential. The United States had proven that nuclear propulsion worked beneath the ocean, and that meant something much larger, because if one submarine could operate this way, others could follow, a fleet could be built, capabilities could expand, and the advantage could be multiplied. If you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where a single breakthrough reshaped entire strategies, consider subscribing, because what the Nautilus had demonstrated was only the beginning, because the next step wouldn't just prove endurance, it would prove reach, and it would take the submarine somewhere no vessel had ever gone before, somewhere that would send a message not just to the Soviet Union, but to the entire world. The next mission would push the Nautilus beyond anything previously attempted, not just in distance, not just in endurance, but in symbolism, because if nuclear propulsion had already changed what submarines could do, this operation would prove what they could reach. The objective was simple in concept, but almost impossible in execution: to travel beneath the Arctic ice cap, completely submerged, from one side of the world to the other. No surfacing, no external navigation, no margin for error. The Arctic was one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Freezing temperatures, unpredictable ice formations, and a ceiling of solid ice that prevented any emergency surfacing. For a conventional submarine, it would have been unthinkable. For the Nautilus, it was a test of everything it had been built to achieve. The preparation was meticulous. Navigation systems had to be adapted, because traditional methods, based on surface references, would not work beneath the ice. The crew trained for scenarios where escape was not an option. Every system was checked, every procedure reviewed, because once the submarine entered the Arctic, it would be completely on its own. When the Nautilus began its journey, the conditions were exactly as expected: darkness, pressure, an environment that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. The ice above formed a barrier that stretched for thousands of miles. Below, the ocean floor varied unpredictably, the margin between them sometimes narrow. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere was focused, controlled, every movement calculated, because in this mission, there was no room for improvisation. As the Nautilus moved deeper into the Arctic, the scale of the challenge became clear. There were moments when the space between the submarine and the ice above was dangerously small. Moments when the terrain below forced careful adjustments. Moments where even a slight miscalculation could lead to consequences that couldn't be reversed. And yet, the submarine continued, steady, silent, unseen, because for the first time, a vessel had the ability to remain underwater long enough and reliably enough to attempt something like this. Day after day, the Nautilus advanced, through darkness, through uncertainty, through an environment that had stopped every previous attempt, until finally, it reached a point that carried enormous meaning. The North Pole, beneath the ice, completely submerged. No flag, no surface presence, just a submarine, proving that the world had changed. For the United States, this wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a strategic message, a demonstration that American submarines could operate anywhere, reach any region, remain undetected, even in the most extreme conditions on Earth. For the Soviet Union, the implications were immediate. If a submarine could travel beneath the Arctic ice, it could approach from directions that were previously considered secure. It could position itself closer to critical areas. It could operate in ways that were difficult, if not impossible, to track. The geography of defense had changed. Barriers that once provided protection were no longer reliable. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where a single mission redefined global strategy, consider subscribing, because what the Nautilus had just demonstrated wasn't just reach. It was access to places that had never been part of the equation before. But as significant as that mission was, its true impact wasn't just in where the Nautilus went. It was in what it proved. Because once the impossible becomes possible, everything that follows has to adapt. And in the Cold War, adaptation could determine the balance between stability and escalation. In the end, the USS Nautilus did more than complete a historic mission. It changed how nations thought about the ocean, because before it, submarines were limited by physics. After it, they were limited only by strategy. The success of the Nautilus proved something undeniable, that nuclear propulsion wasn't just viable, it was transformative. It allowed submarines to remain hidden for as long as necessary, to move across the globe without interruption, to operate in regions that had once been inaccessible, and most importantly, to do all of it without being detected. For the United States, this created a new kind of advantage, not one based on visibility, but on presence, because a submarine that cannot be found can influence decisions without ever being seen. That presence reshaped naval strategy. Submarines became more than support units. They became central to deterrence, platforms capable of carrying advanced weapons, capable of positioning themselves anywhere in the world, capable of remaining there silently waiting. The concept of second strike capability began to take form. The idea that even after an attack, a nation could respond, because its submarines were still out there, undetected, unreachable. And that idea changed the balance of the Cold War, because it reduced the incentive for a first strike. It introduced a level of stability, built not on trust, but on certainty. Certainty that retaliation was always possible. Certainty that no attack could eliminate the response. And that certainty helped prevent escalation. But the impact of the Nautilus went even further. It set the foundation for an entire fleet. Nuclear-powered submarines that would follow. More advanced, more capable, each building on what the Nautilus had proven. The United States didn't just develop a new submarine. It developed a new standard, one that would define naval power for decades and influence how every major nation approached undersea warfare. For the Soviet Union, the message was clear. The ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a pathway, and the side that could control that pathway would hold a critical advantage. The response began quickly. New programs, new designs, efforts to match what had been achieved. But the gap had already been created, and closing it would take time. Time that, in the Cold War, carried strategic weight. Today, the legacy of the USS Nautilus still echoes in modern nuclear submarines, in the strategies that rely on stealth and endurance, in the understanding that control of the unseen can shape the outcome of the visible. Because the Nautilus didn't just expand capability, it expanded possibility. It showed that limitations could be removed, that environments once considered restrictive could become advantageous, and that innovation, when applied with precision, could redefine entire domains of warfare. In the Cold War, that kind of shift mattered, because the competition wasn't just about who had more. It was about who could do more with less visibility, who could operate where others couldn't, who could remain present without being detected. And in that silent competition, beneath the waves, the USS Nautilus ensured that the United States wasn't just participating, it was leading. For more stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because some of the most important turning points in history didn't happen in the spotlight. They happened beneath the surface.